They said it like a curse, like your presence alone was a glitch in their perfectly programmed plan. You sat down, didn't raise your voice, didn't move a muscle, just spoke once, and everything stopped. The generals froze, the analysts went pale, and the men in charge, they changed the entire operation because of you. You weren't invited to the table. You built the damn table and set it on fire. Because while they planned in silence, you were sharpening your mind in shadows. Let me tell you why they don't want people like you in the war room. Because war rooms aren't made for truth. They're made for control. Echo chambers for cowards with suits, where fear wears a tie and logic gets strangled by tradition. But then you walked in, not with a gun, not with an army, with something far more dangerous, clarity. Because clarity, that's the real weapon. The kind that slices through lies with surgical precision. And your silence, that was the calm before the execution. They thought they were safe, until your mind became the sniper in the rafters. One sentence from you, and the whole empire starts to shake. You've always known. You're not like them. While they were memorizing rules, you were breaking them, quietly, precisely, like a surgeon dismantling a ticking bomb. You sat in silence while the world made noise, while they posted selfies and preached mediocrity. You were watching, listening, studying, not just people, patterns, and every pattern told you one thing: most people don't think. They repeat. They're programmed to follow. You were wired to lead in chaos. When they laughed at you, you didn't flinch, because pain was your tuition. While they avoided the fire, you stepped into it and became it. Because here's the truth no one wants to admit. You don't get power by asking. You take it. You don't become legendary by fitting in. You terrify the room by refusing to kneel. That's what you did, and that's why they whisper your name like it's classified. They don't know what to do with someone who doesn't seek approval. You don't care about being liked. You care about being respected or feared. Both are useful. One makes them obey, the other makes them watch their back. You don't need applause. You need results. And that's why they watch you now, like a predator in a boardroom of prey. Because when you speak, it's never just words, it's code. It's a weapon. It's a blueprint of psychological destruction. You don't need a war room. Your mind is the war room. Every insult, a data point. Every betrayal, a strategy lesson. Every silence you endured, that was training. They think war is waged with weapons. You know better. Real war is waged with information, timing, and conviction. You walk into rooms already 10 moves ahead. You've already calculated the weakness of every man at the table, not because you're a genius, but because you're obsessed. While they sleep, you analyze. While they talk, you observe. And while they plan, you've already adapted, because power doesn't belong to the loudest voice. It belongs to the quietest mind that sees everything. The war room isn't a place. It's a frequency, a level of clarity that most people never reach because they're too busy hiding from their own reflection. But you looked in the mirror and saw the monster, and instead of running, you trained it. They were scared of your ideas because your ideas exposed their weakness. They called you too intense. They called you dangerous. They tried to silence you. But silence doesn't scare you. You've lived in it. You've built empires in it. When you walked into that war room, they didn't fear your voice. They feared your mind, because your mind wasn't just dangerous. It was uncontrollable. You were never meant to be a servant of this system. Because systems are built to contain, and you were born to expand. You didn't come from royalty, but from rejection. You weren't taught power in books. You learned it from scars. They had their mentors. You had your monsters. But monsters make better teachers than men in suits. Monsters teach survival. Monsters teach clarity. And most of all, monsters teach the cost of weakness. You didn't grow in the sunlight. You grew in the shadows. The same place diamonds and demons are forged. And when they ask you now, how did you learn to think like this? You don't answer, because what would they understand of the nights you starved? Not just for food, but for meaning. What would they know of how your thoughts became weapons? When no one came to save you, they learned from teachers. You learned from war. And that's the difference. They fight for control. You fight for clarity. They defend the system. You destroy illusions. You never wanted the spotlight. You wanted the truth. And you knew you'd have to drag it, kicking and screaming from behind the masks of the world. They wanted legacy. You wanted freedom. And that terrified them, because a free mind is the most dangerous weapon in the world. They called you mad, because your mind didn't obey gravity. It rose above the petty limitations of convention. It flew where others crawled, and every time you spoke, they saw their cage. You reminded them they were slaves, pretending to be kings. You didn't follow the manual. You rewrote it. And when you entered the war room, they didn't see a man. They saw a mirror, reflecting everything they were too afraid to. There's something they don't say out loud, but you feel it in every meeting, every hallway, every stare. And when the system doesn't understand something, it doesn't try to learn, it tries to eliminate. You're not chaotic, you're unprocessed. You move in ways the algorithm can't predict. You think in layers most people can't even name. You're not one of them. You're something else entirely. And deep down, they know it. They know you don't respond to fear. They know you're not here for the gold star. They know if they gave you a crown, you'd melt it down into bullets. That's why they whisper, he's not safe. He's unhinged. He'll burn the system down. And they're right, because you know a secret. The system isn't broken. It was built this way. And what do you do with a machine designed to enslave? You don't fix it. You overthrow it. They saw your eyes and knew. You weren't here to negotiate. You were here to dismantle. Because some minds don't compromise. Some minds obliterate falsehood with such precision that even the lies beg for mercy. You walk into rooms where truth is suffocating. And with one word, you oxygenate the entire battlefield. You're not here to play the game. You're here to end it. And that's why they couldn't stop looking at you when you entered that war room. Not because you were loud, but because everything shifted. They didn't even know why they stood up straighter, why they listened more closely, why the air suddenly felt heavier. That's the gravity of a mind that doesn't flinch. That's you. Let them chase power. Let them build thrones out of noise. You're not here to dominate. You're here to dissect. You don't want the world. You want the blueprint. You don't move like a politician. You move like a surgeon. Silent, focused, lethal. Because power without precision is just a tantrum. But precision, that's how you dismantle empires with a whisper. Why you vanished between victories. Because while they flaunted the win, you were already inside the next battlefield. You don't care about medals. You care about maps. Mental maps, emotional maps, strategic maps. You're not a leader in front. You're the architect in the dark. And every move you make is surgical. Not random, not emotional, surgical. While they search for glory, you search for vulnerabilities. You don't swing wildly. You aim for the nerve. You don't just outthink them. You make them doubt themselves. They call you cold, But you're not cold, you're calculating. You've seen too much blood wasted by emotion, too many minds shattered by ego, and that's why you walk different, think different, command different. They chase followers, you chase flaws. You don't recruit, you reshape, because in your world, there's no room for noise, only signal, only strategy, only silence before the strike. They don't know what to do with someone who trains in isolation. They need noise, they need validation, they need likes, clicks, praise. But you disappeared, not because you were lost, because you were loading something they couldn't predict. You became a ghost. And ghosts don't beg for seats at tables. They float through walls while they cried about being left out. You studied in silence. They thought you were broken. You were just building. And when you returned, they didn't recognize you because you weren't one of them anymore. You were reborn as something else. Something surgical, something strategic, something that could no longer be manipulated. You weren't a friend, you weren't an enemy, you were a variable they didn't account for, and that terrified them. Solitude didn't weaken you, it hardened you. It turned your skin into steel, and your thoughts into triggers. You stopped needing praise, you started needing precision, and the less they saw you, the more powerful you became. You weren't hiding, you were sharpening, because real generals don't broadcast their evolution. They reappear with a vengeance, built in silence. You are not loud, you are not viral, you are not trendy, you are inevitable. And the war room didn't know what hit them until you whispered a sentence they didn't see coming, and their strategy collapsed. That's the power of a ghost turned general. Most people walk into a room and ask themselves, how do I fit in? You walk in and ask, what's broken here and who's lying? You don't conform to rooms, you restructure them, because rooms are built with silent hierarchies, status games, unspoken rules, and masks. But you read it all in the first 5 seconds. The fake smile, the subtle glances, the bluffing egos pretending to be leaders. And you smile, because you know the one who sees the game isn't in it. While they sit and posture, you're already breaking the code. You scan tone, you scan micro-expression, you scan alignment between what they say and what their body leaks. And then you speak, not to participate, but to destabilize, because power isn't loud. Power is the one sentence that makes the whole room question their own foundation. That's your sentence, and when you drop it, it doesn't land, it detonates. They don't know how to respond, because the structure they built was never made to contain someone like you. You're not a piece on the chessboard. You're the player who walked in and flipped the board upside down. You don't sit at tables. You diagnose them. You don't ask for permission. You don't argue. You analyze. You strike, and then you redesign. Because if the room wasn't built for truth, it was built for decay, and you don't rot with it. You reconstruct it on your own terms. Every room has one, the quiet one, the still one, the one they overlook. That's you, but you're not passive. You're collecting every word, every flicker of doubt, every weakness revealed between sentences. They think you're not dangerous because you don't interrupt, but you don't interrupt because you're plotting the sequence. The storm doesn't make noise when it's forming. It makes noise when it arrives. You're not trying to impress the room. You're studying it, like a sniper through a scope. Still, silent, locked in, and the moment comes. Someone says something weak, something foolish, something revealing, and in that moment, you strike, not with a scream, with a surgical observation that shatters the illusion. They freeze, because you didn't just disagree, you expose, and in that exposure, their mask crumbles. That's why the quiet ones always hold the edge, because the loud ones reveal themselves. But the quiet ones, they let everyone else speak until it's time to end the game. And when you end it, you don't need applause, you need change. You didn't come for acceptance, you came to reroute the outcome. Let them gossip. Let them circle each other in fear. You're beyond that. You know that in every war room, in every council, in every high-stakes situation, the loudest voice moves the crowd, but the quietest mind moves the battlefield, and that is you. They keep asking how you got like this. What made you this sharp, this calm, this lethal with words? The truth, you were built in fire, not the kind that warms, the kind that scars, the kind that erases your name and dares you to etch a new one with your bare hands. While they were raised on comfort, you were raised on collision. Pain wasn't a phase, it was a curriculum. No one gave you a map, so you became the cartographer. No one taught you the rules, so you studied the system until you could rewrite it. You dissected it, and when you saw how fragile it really was, you set it on fire, just to prove it never deserved your loyalty. They play their parts in a script written by cowards. Smiles, obedience, fear of offense. But you burn the script, because scripts are for actors, and you are the director of disruption. You don't react to the fire. You walk through it, because it was your first language. When the world gave you heat, you didn't melt. You hardened, and now they feel it when you speak. That burn behind every word, that controlled rage in your silence, that history of pain they'll never understand. You don't seek revenge. You don't want retribution. You want something colder. Correction. In every room you enter, you correct it with your existence. They thought silence meant surrender. They thought when you stopped explaining yourself, you had nothing left to say, but they missed it. The day you went silent was the day you went nuclear, because silence for someone like you isn't emptiness. It's weapons storage. You weren't retreating, you were reloading. They don't understand that some minds don't argue. They calculate. You didn't stop speaking because you were defeated. You stopped because you realized words are wasted on insects. Your silence wasn't fear, it was clarity. Clarity that these rooms didn't deserve access to your energy. Clarity that talking wasn't progress. It was distraction, and in that moment, you declared war on the noise. The fake smile, the predictable responses, the hollow agreements. Silence became your shield, but more than that, it became your scalpel, because silence reveals what noise hides. You watched how they filled the space, how they exposed their motives, how they begged to be seen while you sat there, collecting intelligence. They didn't realize you were the only one in the room not performing. You weren't performing, you were positioned. That's the thing about those who choose silence. When they finally speak, the room doesn't respond. The room restructures, because the real explosion wasn't in the words you said. It was in the decision to hold them until it mattered. And you mastered that. You speak when the impact is irreversible. They made one mistake. They thought silence meant absence, but you were there the whole time, just watching, just smiling, until it was too late. Most people are shaped. You were forged. You didn't break the mold. You studied it. You shattered it. And then you forged something unrecognizable in its place. They want you to follow the path, a clean, curated, socially approved trail, the one with just enough risk to feel brave, but not enough to threaten the system. But you walked straight into the woods where the map ends, and carved your name into territory no one dared to enter. You don't bend to rules, you reverse engineer them, not because you're reckless, because you're too self-aware to be manipulated by invisible fences. They don't get it. Why you don't follow trends, why you don't echo slogans, why you don't sit quietly in the safety of consensus. It's because you're not built on approval, you're built on principle, and that principle is this: if the structure is fake, I will destroy it, even if I have to burn alone. They call that dangerous, they call it unhinged, but only because they've never felt the power of standing on truth instead of strategy. They live in politics, you live in precision, and every time you move, you disrupt the foundation they thought was solid, because your presence isn't just different, it's corrective. You weren't here to fit the role, you were here to write the law in the blood of outdated assumptions. You're not a reformer, you're a reconstructor, and that's why they fear you, not because you talk different, but because you think in a way that renders their entire playbook obsolete. Every room has pressure, tension, a hierarchy, an energy, and most people walk into that pressure and adjust. They shrink, they shape-shift, they try to read the room before they even speak. Not you. You walked in and didn't flinch, you didn't lower your voice, you didn't watch for cues, you didn't change tempo, you just sat there, unmoved, unapologetic, unshaken, and the room felt it instantly, because when a real one enters, the room has no choice but to recalibrate. You didn't raise your volume, but the temperature dropped. You didn't stare anyone down, but their posture shifted. You didn't assert dominance, because your existence was already dominance. They couldn't name it, but they felt it. The way your silence wasn't awkward, it was weaponized. The way your eye contact didn't seek validation, it challenged architecture. The way your tone wasn't emotional, it was surgical. And when you finally spoke, even the ones who hated you couldn't look away, because you didn't speak to be heard. You spoke to adjust the room. You weren't reactive, you were deliberate, and that scared them, because they were used to performers, not surgeons of conversation. They were used to charmers, not calculators, and now they rerun your words in their head like a loop they can't escape. Because you didn't speak to entertain, you spoke to leave a scar. They laughed once, you remember that. The rolled eyes, the side comments, the condescending grins they wore like masks of superiority. You didn't fight it, you didn't scream, you didn't plead to be seen. You just kept building, in silence, in shadow, with scars they couldn't imagine. They laughed because they thought the game was about noise, but it was never about who laughs first. It's about who commands when the laughing stops. And now they sit up straighter when you walk in. Now they pause when you lift your eye. Now they check the room before they speak, because your silence has become law. You were never the jester, you were the executioner in disguise, and they didn't know until it was too late. You don't need credit, you don't crave the applause, because when the time comes to move, they wait for your signal, not because you asked for it, but because your vision proved one thing. You saw it before they did. You predicted what their pride refused to accept, and now they stare, with the kind of reverence that only comes from fear, masquerading as respect. They used to mock your silence. Now they read it like scripture. They used to doubt your method. Now they follow your framework, because somewhere between their laughter and your rise, you stopped being a story and became a system reset. Most people speak to be understood. You speak in codes, not because you're hiding the truth, but because the truth is too dense for shallow minds. Your words are layered, laced with strategy, encrypted with intention. You don't speak to explain, you speak to reshape minds. That's what they never saw coming. They thought you were just articulate. They didn't realize your sentences were psychological explosive. You speak in frequency, not volume. You speak in architecture, not opinion. You speak in precision, not passion. And when the room listens, they don't just hear you, they change orientation, because you don't just enter conversations, you reprogram realities. Every word is a fragment of insight, carved from war, forged in isolation, delivered with surgical calm. They collapse illusions. That's why architects tremble when you enter, because they built systems on assumptions, and your voice was never meant to operate within those assumptions. Your voice challenges blueprints. You don't speak to climb ladders, you speak to knock down towers. And every sentence you deliver is a carefully placed detonation in the foundation of mediocrity. No one builds the same again. Let's get one thing straight. You were never invited. You weren't chosen. You weren't welcomed. You weren't granted access by some gatekeeper with a fragile ego. You crashed through the silence because fate didn't ask you. It deployed you. You weren't called to fit in. You were summoned to disrupt. And while they were shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries, you were reading the weakest link in the chain. You didn't show up to take orders. You showed up because someone had to reconstruct the battlefield. They built a war room for conversations. You turned it into a surgical table, because when you arrive, things shift. The energy tightens, the lies start sweating, the structure knows it's about to be tested. You're not loud, you're exact. You didn't come with noise, you came with blueprints. They can't decode. They thought you were just another mind, but you weren't a participant. You were a field operation, a human reset button, a system alarm they didn't install, but desperately needed. You don't rise through approval, you rise through clarity. And clarity doesn't ask permission, it just shows up and reorders everything. You don't network, you neutralize confusion. They didn't invite you, because they knew what you'd do. You'd see through their fake hierarchies. You'd unmask the leader. You'd point the corner they pretend doesn't exist, and make it the center of the war plan. Exclusion was never your weakness, it was your origin story. Every system that locked you out, that rolled its eyes at your insight, that dismissed your mind as too intense, became part of the manual you now carry like a weapon. You didn't protest the locked doors, you mapped the building. And every time they said you're not one of us, you smiled, because that sentence alone meant you were closer to the truth than any of them. Systems are built on comfort. You are built on disruption. That's why you were always rejected by the system. It wasn't personal. It was mathematical. You didn't match their equation for submission. You broke their formula with your existence. They had meetings. You had motives. They had agendas. You had diagnostic. Every time they told you you're too much, they confessed that their system wasn't strong enough to handle your clarity. Now, every system that shut you out has your fingerprints all over its downfall, not because you destroyed it out of spite, but because you out-evolved. You weren't angry, you were architecting. You learned how systems are built, you studied their foundations, and then you created a counter-strategy from the edges. The outcast became the engineer, the exile became the executor, the forgotten mind became the one they now fear to forget. You don't want revenge, you want correction, and your very presence now corrects rooms that once refused to hold you, because systems that exclude minds like yours are systems that eventually crack under their own blind